They spent billions building the U-boat fleet that was supposed to starve Britain. But the weapon that crippled it wasn't a battleship or a new bomb. It was a piece of chalk in the hands of a 19-year-old girl, and within weeks, U-boat crews were dying 3 times faster than ever before. At the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, far from the North Atlantic storms and the steel hulls that contested them, a small basement in Liverpool became one of the most decisive rooms in the entire war. It was located beneath Derby House, headquarters of the Western Approaches Command. The room was officially a training space, nothing more than a concrete chamber with low ceilings, poor ventilation, and walls that dripped with condensation during the winter months. But in 1942 and 1943, officers who descended the narrow stairwell understood that this dimly lit basement carried a weight of consequence equal to any battlefield at sea. British naval officers arrived exhausted after long shifts, tracking U-boat movements. Teacups sat cold on wooden desks. Chalk dust lingered in the air. At the center of the room, linoleum sheets covered the floor, painted with a vast grid representing hundreds of square miles of the Atlantic. Small wooden markers, each symbolizing a merchant ship, destroyer, corvette, or German submarine, stood arranged on the surface like pieces in a slow, relentless game. This pit, as it became known, was not glamorous, but what happened here influenced decisions that determined whether convoys reached Britain intact or disappeared beneath the waves. The contradiction at the heart of this scene was striking. The Battle of the Atlantic was the largest and longest campaign of the Second World War. It depended on advanced sonar, depth charges, radar, high-frequency direction finding, and the industrial power of allied shipyards. Yet inside this basement, the most important tool was a simple piece of white chalk. With it, instructors traced the movements of escorts and U-boats, reconstructing attacks, simulating new tactics, and exposing flaws in long-established doctrine. It was here that a handful of young women from the Women's Royal Naval Service WRNS, commonly called WRENs, demonstrated insights that would eventually change the course of the campaign. Among them was a teenager, Jeanne O'Carroll, who joined the Western Approaches Tactical Unit in mid-1942. She had been studying mathematics before the war, and possessed a notable ability to recognize spatial patterns and interpret movement across grids. In an era when naval command was dominated by officers with decades of sea experience, her presence in the pit was unusual, yet her calculations, drawn in chalk across the enormous floor map, revealed threats that more senior men often could not see in real time. She was trained not to memorize naval traditions, but to analyze the geometry of convoy protection, turning reaction times, visibility ranges, and the gaps that appeared when escorts maneuvered too aggressively. Her work took place during one of the most dangerous periods Britain had ever faced. In early 1943, the U-boat force commanded by Admiral Carl Dönitz reached its peak strength. Wolfpacks coordinated attacks across the central Atlantic, often slipping through lightly defended areas where Allied aircraft coverage could not reach. Merchant shipping losses climbed to catastrophic levels. In February 1943 alone, 63 merchant vessels over 340,000 tons were sunk. Britain's survival depended on the flow of fuel, food, munitions, and raw materials from North America. Analysts in London calculated that if the rate continued, the nation would face fuel shortages by summer and a food crisis by autumn. Inside Derby House, officers studying these figures experienced a different kind of tension from those serving aboard escort vessels, but no less severe. They understood that every failed tactic and every misjudged maneuver at sea translated into thousands of lost tons of supplies and hundreds of sailors' lives. The Admiralty's long-standing doctrine emphasized aggressive pursuit of enemy contacts, a principle rooted in centuries of British naval tradition. But the pit revealed that this instinct, effective in surface warfare, became dangerously counterproductive against submerged submarines. When escorts chased a U-boat contact too far from the convoy, they left open corridors that Wolfpacks exploited with deadly precision. The atmosphere in the basement reflected the urgency of these discoveries. The instructors, many of them WRENs, worked long hours reconstructing convoy battles chalk line by chalk line. They demonstrated how a convoy screen collapsed not because commanders were negligent, but because the U-boats had learned to manipulate predictable British reactions. They showed that the supposed strength of aggressive pursuit had become a fatal weakness. Officers who arrived confident in their experience often left the pit unsettled, aware that the enemy had been using their own doctrine against them. This contrast cold stone walls, simple tools, and young instructors reshaping naval thinking symbolized a deeper truth about the Battle of the Atlantic. Victory would not come only from new weapons or larger fleets. It required understanding the enemy's strategy and correcting the blind spots created by institutional habit. In this basement, chalk replaced gunpowder, geometry replaced instinct, and clarity replaced tradition. It was here, in a space view civilians ever saw, that the Royal Navy began to realize that ideas could be as decisive as depth charges. By the spring of 1943, the work done in the pit was preparing to collide with the reality of the ocean. The doctrines tested on chalk grids would soon be used in the Central Atlantic, where convoys faced the full force of the German submarine fleet. The transformation that began in this basement, quiet, methodical, and grounded in mathematics, would help turn the most desperate phase of the U-boat war into the beginning of its decline. By 1942, the Royal Navy's escort commanders operated under a doctrine shaped by centuries of surface warfare. The principle was simple. When the enemy revealed itself, a British warship closed the distance, brought its guns to bear, and destroyed the threat before it could strike again. This instinct, offensive, direct, aggressive, had served Britain well against the Spanish Armada, the French fleets of the Napoleonic Wars, and even German surface raiders in the First World War. But the Battle of the Atlantic was not a contest of ships exchanging broadsides across open water. It was a contest against an enemy that preferred darkness, deception, and patience. And it was here that a fundamental flaw in British doctrine collided with an entirely different kind of warfare. For the men aboard the merchant convoys, the danger rarely appeared in the form of a visible ship on the horizon. Most U-boat attacks began without warning, announced only by the sudden roar of an explosion or the violent shudder of a vessel breaking apart. Sailors described hearing torpedoes strike in the night, followed by the sound of metal tearing open, cargo shifting, and flames rising as oil spilled across the surface. Often, they never saw the submarine that fired the shot. It had already slipped beneath the waves, using darkness and limited visibility to mask its escape. Escorts stationed around the convoys faced immense pressure. Destroyers and corvettes carried hydrophones and radar sets that were improving with each passing year. But detection remained imperfect. A periscope briefly visible at dusk, a sonar ping distorted by thermoclines, or a faint radio intercept hinted at danger without confirming it. When an escort picked up a contact visual or acoustic, the instinct drilled into British officers for generations was immediate and forceful pursuit. Engines roared to full power. The ship heeled sharply as the helm swung toward the suspected. Location depth charges were set and dropped in patterns intended to box in the enemy. But this instinct had a hidden consequence. As the escort surged forward, it left a widening gap in the protective ring surrounding the convoy. From the sailor's perspective on the bridge, the maneuver felt correct, decisive action against the enemy. Yet for German commanders monitoring the convoy from periscope depth, the gap created by this reaction was precisely the opening they needed. The Wolfpacks, positioned in loose groups across the ocean, exploited these moments with remarkable discipline. The German strategy under Admiral Karl Dönitz relied on coordinated attacks, designed to overwhelm and confuse. A single U-boat would surface or briefly expose its periscope to draw attention. This deliberate appearance was not a mistake, it was bait. Once the British destroyer or corvette committed to the chase, the U-boat submerged and evaded, conserving torpedoes while abandoning the battlefield entirely. Meanwhile, other submarines, often 2, 3, or more, moved silently toward the unprotected flank of the convoy on board the merchant ships. The scene that followed was chaotic. Reports from survivors describe hearing distant gunfire or star shells from the pursuing escort, while, on the opposite side of the convoy, torpedoes struck in rapid succession. Vessels caught in the center of the formation had little warning before the water erupted beside them. At night, the darkness made it nearly impossible to determine where the next strike would fall. The smoke from burning tankers obscured navigation lights, and emergency flares distorted the horizon. Decisions had to be made in seconds: alter course, signal for help, attempt rescue operations. But the escorts were too far away, locked into a pursuit that no longer mattered. This pattern repeated with alarming consistency. Chasing the first U-boat ensured that others could attack unopposed. British officers later described the experience as fighting an enemy who always seemed to be in two places at once. They believed they were engaging decisively, yet their efforts served the German plan more effectively than their own. The flaw was not technological. It was psychological and inherited belief that offensive action always produced advantage. German commanders understood this tendency well. Their training emphasized patience, coordinated positioning, and exploiting predictable enemy behavior. The mathematics behind the tactic were elegant. When an escort ship moved outward at full speed, its turning radius increased dramatically. It required time and distance to return to its original position. During those minutes, the convoy's defensive geometry collapsed. The gap widened like a doorway opened by accident. A Wolfpack position just beyond sonar range could calculate this interval with precision. They did not need speed, they needed timing. In the pit at Derby House, these patterns became impossible to ignore. Chalk lines traced the arcs of destroyers, braking formation. Markers representing U-boats moved methodically into the exposed corridor. In simulation after simulation, the result was identical. The first contact vanished, and the real attack came from the opposite direction. Officers who witnessed these exercises felt a growing discomfort. The doctrine they trusted had been turned against them. What felt like bravery charging toward the enemy was producing defeat. This was the trap no admiral fully understood at the time. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a contest of force, but of geometry and patience. The Germans had built a strategy on the psychological habits of their opponent. Until those habits changed, no amount of technology or shipbuilding could compensate. It was not the machinery of war that needed improvement, it was the mindset guiding it. Only when British commanders accepted this reality did the tide begin to shift. The system built inside the Western Approach's tactical unit was unlike anything used elsewhere. In the Allied command structure, at first glance, it appeared rudimentary strips of linoleum painted with a massive grid, chalk-lined sectors representing the North Atlantic, and wooden blocks shaped into merchant ships, escorts, and U-boats. But this was not a game board. It was a full physical simulation of convoy warfare, designed to expose patterns invisible to the human eye during real combat. The women who operated it, many barely out of school, translated sonar reports, convoy logs, and attack records into geometric models that revealed how battles actually unfolded. Beneath the fog of war. The grid allowed movements to be measured precisely. Each square represented a defined area of ocean. Each turn of the clock equaled a specific number of minutes. Speed, turning radius, visibility range, and submerged limits were coded directly into how the pieces moved. When an escort peeled away from the convoy at high speed, the chalk line charting its course swept across the floor in a wide arc. When a U-boat submerged to evade detection, its marker shifted according to known underwater speeds and battery endurance. Gradually, the WRENs reconstructed entire battles down to the minute. What startled many officers was the accuracy with which these young women could anticipate U-boat behavior. By studying multiple engagements, they recognized the rhythm of German Wolfpack attacks, the spacing between submarines, and the timing of decoy tactics. When a single U-boat surfaced within visual range of a convoy, the WRENs could already predict the likely direction of the real attack based on the convoy's position, moonlight, cloud cover, and the historical patterns of the Wolfpacks in that sector. Chalk marks traced the probable movement of submarines even when no Allied ship had reported them. These predictions made some commanders uncomfortable. Many had spent decades at sea and resisted the idea that geometric reasoning could outmaneuver human judgment. Yet as the simulations played out, escorts following traditional doctrine repeatedly opened fatal gaps in the protective ring around convoys. The chalk lines documenting these movements told a story more damning than any written report could. Instructors circled the exposed corridor with thick strokes of white chalk, visually demonstrating how a single aggressive maneuver created an opening wide enough for multiple U-boats to slip through. Officers often dismissed the simulation results. At first, some argued the rules favored the enemy. Others insisted the chalkboard exaggerated the danger, or that real-life conditions would prevent U-boats from exploiting such openings. But the WRENs responded not with theory, but with data. They pulled convoy logs from engagements in the mid-Atlantic, overlaying them onto the chalk grids. The alignment was striking. Escort movements that had seemed sensible during combat turning toward a sonar echo, accelerating to chase a periscope produced the same geometric consequences on both the floor map and in the real battle reports. In several cases, convoys that had suffered heavy losses mirrored simulations the WRENs had run days or weeks earlier. Escorts had chased decoys at nearly identical angles and speeds. U-boats had infiltrated through the same gaps. The casualties, listed in Admiralty records, corresponded line by line with the predicted outcomes on the floor. Officers who had questioned the simulation framework found themselves looking at the chalk reconstruction of their own decisions and the consequences they had unknowingly created. The emotional reactions varied. Some officers stood in silence as the implications settled in. Others grew defensive, attributing their failures to weather, miscommunication, or flawed intelligence. But the WRENs maintained their focus on the geometry. They demonstrated that no matter the specific conditions, any escort chasing beyond a certain threshold left the convoy vulnerable. The mathematics did not change with rank or experience. The ocean followed predictable rules, and the U-boats understood them better than the escorts did. Gradually, disbelief turned to recognition. Commanders began to appreciate that the chalk grids were not simplifications. They were magnifications. The system removed the confusion of night battles, the distortion of fear, and the chaos of scattered reports. It showed the underlying structure of every U-boat attack. Chalk lines that seemed abstract became a language of survival. The officers realized that the WRENs were not predicting the future, they were revealing the logic that had governed past failures. The turning point came when repeated simulations produced outcomes identical to recent convoy disasters. Patterns that had taken the Germans months to exploit were exposed in minutes on the floor. Officers could now see how a Wolfpack orchestrated its movements and how easily a single error within the escort screen cascaded into catastrophe. In that basement, humility became a tactical asset. The willingness to accept an uncomfortable truth mattered as much as the tactics themselves. What began as a simple chalkboard exercise evolved into a weapon more powerful than many depth charge patterns. While explosives could damage a submarine already detected, the simulations prevented submarines from reaching firing range in the first place. By predicting failure before it occurred, the WRENs gave the Royal Navy something it desperately needed: a method to interrupt the Wolfpack's design. Geometry, not gunfire, became the basis of the next evolution in anti-submarine warfare. Chalk marks on linoleum would never appear on wartime propaganda posters or in naval museums, but in early 1943, they proved deadlier than many of the weapons deployed at sea. The WRENs had not created a new explosive device or detection instrument. They had revealed the geometry that governed life and death in the Atlantic, and once commanders understood it, the balance of the campaign began to shift. By early 1943, the work inside the Western Approach's tactical unit had already begun to unsettle a growing number of escort commanders. Officers arrived confident in their experience, studied the chalk floor reconstructions, and left recognizing that something fundamental in their doctrine had failed. But the shift remained incomplete. What happened in the pit still needed acceptance from the highest levels of the Royal Navy. Without approval from the Admiralty, the simulations remained an academic exercise rather than a directive capable of changing the war. That moment arrived when Admiral Sir Max Horton, Commander-in-Chief of the Western Approaches, agreed to visit Derby House. Horton was no ceremonial figurehead. He had commanded submarines in the First World War with exceptional success, and carried a reputation for decisiveness and intolerance for vague theories. He believed in results, not abstractions. Many officers assumed that once he saw the simulations, he would dismiss them as unrealistic and reaffirm the aggressive tactics the Navy had trusted for generations. His visit generated tension throughout the building. For the WRENs, including Jean Hocarel, it meant their work would face its most formidable scrutiny yet. When Horton descended the narrow steps into the pit, the atmosphere shifted immediately. Officers and instructors stood straighter. Conversations stopped. His presence carried decades of authority and the weight of a service tradition that had shaped British naval doctrine since the 18th century. Horton examined the room with a practiced eye, noting the chalk grids, the model ships, and the rows of young women operating the simulation. He listened as Captain Gilbert Roberts, who directed the tactical unit, explained the methodology, how convoy battles were reconstructed, how escort movements were tested, and how the simulations had exposed the flaw in pursuing decoy contacts. Horton remained expressionless. He did not challenge the explanation, nor did he endorse it. He simply stated that he preferred to evaluate the system directly. Instead of observing a demonstration, he would command the escort group in the next simulation himself. Officers nearby understood the significance. If the Admiral succeeded where others had failed, the simulations would likely be dismissed. If he did not, the implications would reach every escort flotilla in the North Atlantic. The WRENs prepared the floor for a scenario representing typical mid-ocean conditions. A convoy of merchant ships surrounded by 8 escorts facing a Wolfpack positioned along its projected path. Jean O'Carroll and her colleague Jean Laidlaw would direct the U-boats, following the known tactics Dennis's commanders used to exploit gaps in convoy screens. Horton took command of the escorts with the confidence of a man who had spent decades studying naval warfare and leading ships under fire. At the start, the convoy advanced in standard formation. Horton deployed his escorts along a wide perimeter, arranging overlapping search zones, doctrine that had defined British escort strategy since the beginning of the war. For a moment, the room fell silent except for the sound of chalk tapping against the floor as the WRENs marked positions. Then, as planned, the lead U-boat surfaced briefly at the edge of visibility. Horton reacted instantly, just as countless commanders had done during real convoy battles. He ordered 2 of his fastest destroyers to break formation and intercept the contact at speed. It was an instinct refined by years of naval training. Locate the enemy, pursue aggressively, and eliminate the threat before it could strike. Chalk lines traced the destroyer's movement across the linoleum, arcing outward and sweeping wide curves. Jean's and Jean waited precisely the amount of time German commanders typically allowed during decoy maneuvers. Then, silently, they moved the remaining U-boat pieces toward the hole the escorts had just created in the screen. The chalk marks documenting their movement were small, deliberate, and geometric. They represented submarines exploiting an opening, calculated not by chance, but by design. Within minutes, the Wolfpack had penetrated the convoy's defensive ring on the chalkboard. The WRENs marked each successful torpedo strike with red chalk. Merchant ships disappeared as simulated explosions consumed them. By the time Horton's destroyers completed their pursuit arc and returned to the convoy's flank, the damage was already catastrophic. In less than an hour of simulation time, 17 merchant ships were marked as sunk. Not a single U-boat had been destroyed. Officers watching the demonstration exchanged glances. They had seen similar results many times, but never with the Admiral commanding. Horton studied the board in silence. The gap his escorts created was undeniable. The U-boat's infiltration path aligned perfectly with the chalk lines described in previous simulations. The result matched the pattern seen repeatedly in real-world convoy losses. He looked at the WRENs not with dismissal, but with recognition. The mathematics was valid. The conclusion was unavoidable. Jean and Jean reset the scenario at Horton's request. This time, he instructed the escorts to maintain a tight defensive perimeter. When the decoy U-boat appeared, he refused to chase. Chalk lines showed his destroyers holding formation, maintaining overlapping fields of fire. The U-boats circled but found no entry point. Each attempt collapsed against the geometry of the screen. After 90 minutes of simulated time, the WRENs marked the outcome. No merchant ships lost, no escorts damaged. What unfolded in those 2 simulations delivered a clarity that had eluded the Admiralty for months. The aggressive pursuit doctrine was not simply outdated, it was counterproductive. The geometry of convoy defense, when understood fully, demanded discipline rather than instinct, coordination rather than heroism. Horton absorbed the conclusion with the gravity of a commander who had witnessed both the power and the limitations of traditional doctrine. His response marked the turning point. After studying the results and questioning the WRENs about the timing, distances, and tactical reasoning, he issued a directive that every escort commander in the western approaches would undergo training in the pit. The simulations were no longer an experiment. They were now operational doctrine. In that basement, a fundamental shift occurred. The hierarchy of experience bowed to the authority of evidence. The WRENs, through mathematical precision and geometric insight, had demonstrated what depth charges and radar alone had not, that understanding the enemy's strategy mattered as much as the weapons used to fight him. The day the Admiral saw his fleet collapse on the chalkboard was the day the Royal Navy changed its course in the Battle of the Atlantic. The tactical transformation that emerged from the Western Approach's tactical unit did not rely on new machinery, advanced weaponry, or classified innovations. It rested on a set of principles so simple that they could be drawn in chalk, yet so effective that they reshaped the Atlantic War within months. These principles formed the foundation of a new escort doctrine, one that rejected instinctive aggression in favor of controlled geometry, disciplined positioning, and coordinated illumination. It became known informally among commanders as the chalk trick, because every maneuver had first been tested and refined on the gridded floor of the pit. The first element was the tightened escort screen. Instead of spreading destroyers and corvettes widely across the horizon, the new doctrine placed them in a close ring around the merchant vessels. This minimized the chance of unseen infiltration and ensured overlapping sonar and visual coverage. Escorts no longer raced outward at high speed when a periscope or U-boat silhouette appeared. The old pattern of pursuit was abandoned entirely. Commanders were instructed to hold position unless the enemy was already inside the convoy screen. This zero-pursuit rule contradicted generations of naval instinct, but it prevented the gaps that Wolfpacks relied upon. Illumination tactics were revised as well. Instead of a single escort firing star shells while chasing a contact, all escorts within range launched coordinated illumination patterns. Star shells fired from multiple angles eliminated the darkness that U-boats depended on when surfacing to attack. German commanders reported that new Allied illumination techniques created a false dawn that exposed periscopes, wakes, and shadows across the convoy. The WRENs had proven on the chalkboard that coordinated lighting disrupted U-boat timing and forced premature dives, reducing their ability to maneuver into optimal firing positions. Defensive maneuvers also shifted from reactive chases to pattern-based actions. The pit simulations emphasized predictable arcs and timings that exploited a U-boat's slower turning radius and submerged speed. Escorts were taught to perform synchronized lateral shifts, creating moving barriers that compressed the available space for a submarine to attack. These maneuvers resembled a geometric puzzle developing across the ocean surface, each ship occupying a sector that reinforced the positions of the others. One of the most surprising contributions came in the realm of torpedo evasion. When German acoustic torpedoes began to appear, the WRENs analyzed their turning characteristics and speed. On the chalkboard, they modeled the torpedo's tracking ability and determined that a specific 60-degree turn executed at the right moment caused the weapon to overshoot and lose its acoustic lock. This tactic, later adopted across multiple escort groups, saved numerous ships by exploiting nothing more than the physics of underwater movement. The implementation of this doctrine at sea was immediate. Commanders who had trained in the pit returned to their flotillas with a new understanding of U-boat behavior. Reports from the Atlantic in early 1943 reveal a striking shift. Wolfpack attacks that previously penetrated convoy screens with ease were now encountering resistance. U-boats attempting to exploit gaps found those gaps closed. Escorts no longer pursued decoys, denying German commanders the openings their tactics depended upon. Coordinated star shell illumination disrupted night attacks, and U-boats were forced to submerge earlier than planned, reducing their speed and situational awareness. Several convoy battles illustrate this change. Convoy Ons 5 in late April and early May 1943 became one of the decisive engagements of the campaign. Although the convoy initially suffered losses, the newly trained escorts used coordinated illumination, tightened defenses, and disciplined formation holding to counter a large Wolfpack. Over the course of the battle, 7 U-boats were sunk. Other convoys during this period reported similar outcomes: fewer merchant ships lost, and more submarines forced into retreat or destroyed. The cumulative impact culminated in what historians call Black May of 1943. In that single month, the German U-boat arm suffered its worst losses of the war. 41 submarines destroyed, many others damaged, and dozens forced to withdraw before firing torpedoes. For the first time, the hunters had become the hunted. Dönitz recognized that the loss rate was unsustainable and ordered his remaining U-boats to abandon the North Atlantic. The success of the new doctrine demonstrated that the most decisive weapon in the Battle of the Atlantic was not steel or explosives, but insight, the ability to understand the geometry of escort protection and the psychology of U-boat strategy. The chalk lines drawn in the basement at Derby House had translated into maneuver patterns that reshaped the battlefield. Fear gave way to control, and the convoys that once sailed as vulnerable targets became coordinated defensive systems capable of withstanding the most determined submarine assaults. The intellectual victory forged in the pit became the foundation for Allied dominance at sea. When the Battle of the Atlantic finally turned in favor of the Allies, newspapers credited new technology, improved radar, long-range aircraft, and the resilience of merchant crews. Almost no mention was made of the Western approach's tactical unit or the women whose calculations reshaped the doctrine that protected those convoys. Their contribution remained hidden, not by oversight alone, but by design. The tactical unit was classified, and every member signed the Official Secrets Act. They were forbidden to speak about the simulations the tactical innovations, or their role in rewriting Royal Navy procedure. For decades after the war, convoy veterans who survived the Atlantic crossings never learned that their safe passage owed much to the work of young women in a basement. In Liverpool, escort commanders did not know the names of the WRENs who trained them. Reports circulated through the Admiralty, without identifying who had constructed the simulations behind them. By the time wartime secrecy was lifted, most participants had moved on with their lives, beginning families and civilian careers, leaving little public trace of the extraordinary responsibility they had carried during their youth. Yet the results were substantial. Historians analyzing U-boat losses and convoy survival rates have shown that the doctrinal changes developed in the tactical units saved thousands of sailors. The Titan screen formations, coordinated illumination patterns, disciplined non-pursuit rules, and geometric evasion tactics all originated on the chalked grids of the pit. Escort groups that trained there returned to sea with a new understanding of Wolfpack strategy, and their performance changed the outcome of key battles. Merchant ships that would likely have been lost under earlier Doctrine completed their crossings. Men who might have drowned in the freezing Atlantic made it home. The women behind these innovations received little recognition during the war and almost none in its immediate aftermath. Many continued their studies or entered teaching careers. Some never spoke in detail about their wartime service even to their families. Their work blended into the larger narrative of Allied victory, overshadowed by ships, weapons, and commanders whose names were more familiar to the public. It was not until archival material was released in the late 20th century that researchers began to reconstruct the full impact of the tactical unit and the role played by its WREN analysts. Among the recovered documents were photographs taken inside the pit during 1943. One of them shows a group of young women standing around the vast linoleum grid, chalk in hand, reviewing the movement of escort groups and U-boats. Their expressions are focused, calm, and analytical, an image of concentration rather than celebration. For decades, this scene remained unknown outside naval circles, yet it captured the essence of a contribution that altered the course of the Atlantic War. The legacy of these women is not measured in medals or public acclaim, but in the convoys that reached Britain, the sailors who returned home, and the strategic clarity that emerged when Doctrine gave way to evidence. The chalk lines they drew were temporary, wiped away at the end of each exercise, but their influence endured, shaping decisions made far from the basement where they worked. In the end, the story of the tactical unit is a reminder that some of the most decisive victories in wartime occur not on open seas but in quiet rooms, where insight becomes the difference between loss and survival. On the floor of the pit, long after the last simulation ended, chalk dust settled into the lines of the grid. It left no monument, no inscription, only the memory of a moment when knowledge turned the tide of a global conflict and saved thousands of lives.